Hi, this is Jack Daulton. I'm still in Laos exploring the enigmatic site known as the Plain of Jars.
And I'm Roz Ho, exploring the Plain of Jars with Jack Daulton.
Once again, the Plain of Jars is a plateau located near the city of Phonsavan in Shangquan province. And we're east of Luang Prabang, aren't we, Roz?
Yes, we're about 270 kilometers east of Luang Prabang, and it took us about 6 or 7 hours to drive here yesterday.
So we're well east of the Mekong, which is where Luang Prabang is located. It was an interesting drive, driving from a relative lowland area, Luang Prabang, on the Mekong, up into the highlands. We encountered the Hmong people as well as the Kamu people along the way.
Yeah, we did some very interesting visits in some of their villages. And it turns out it's also, yesterday was New Year's Day for the Hmong people.
That's right, just coincidentally, our great luck. Anyway, we began the morning today exploring site number 1 of the archaeological complex known as the Plain of Jars. The Plain of Jars refers to this plateau in central Laos. It's located at about 600 meters above sea level. The surrounding mountains, because the plateau is surrounded by mountains, range up to about 2,600 meters above sea level. These stone jars are located on the periphery of this plateau for the most part, and on the slopes of the mountains. And we're at another site now. This is site number 2. We visited site number 3. We visited site number 1 earlier this morning. Site number 3, where we are now, has about 80 to 90 of these jars. These jars are, this jar complex is one of the most important megalithic sites, or large stone prehistoric sites in the world. In fact, It's considered the most important prehistoric site in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and actually these jars date from about 2,000 years old, about 500 BC to about 500 AD, and we're not really sure what culture actually created these jars and what they were really used for.
Yeah, the people who live in this part of Laos now came here about 1,000 years ago, and so the present population did not create these jars. Some other civilization or culture of the distant past created these jars. It's one of the riddles of this ancient complex, and there are other riddles too. One of the riddles is not only who made the jars, when they were made precisely, but also why they were made. Now, Roz, as you know, in the 1930s, the first archaeological work was done here by the French. Madeleine Coulagny, the French archaeologist, excavated about 12 of these sites, and she found inside these large stone receptacles or jars, she found cremation remains.
Yeah, so the speculation is that these were burial monuments, and in fact subsequent archaeological excavations substantiate that.
Yeah, after the excavations in the 1930s, exploration of this complex did not commence again until the late 1990s, when a Lao UNESCO team began to explore the Plain of Jar sites. And in the 2000s, a Belgian archaeologist, Julie Vandenberg, also associated with UNESCO, has been surveying the sites, and they also found cremation remains in and around the jars. So, as you said, Roz, it's believed that these are mortuary containers, sort of coffins, as it were. In fact, they believe that originally they probably had lids, and there are some stone discs laying around which may have been those lids.
Although some of them are thought to be stone markers, marking grave sites.
Yep.
And also, just to follow on that, I believe that they have found secondary burial remains of uncremated human remains as well. So it's really kind of puzzling why there are some cremated remains as well as some uncremated remains.
Well, one theory, as you know, Roz, is that the high-ranking members of the Plain of Jars culture were buried in the jars, cremated and buried in the jars, and perhaps lower-ranking members of society were not cremated and were buried outside the jars in conventional burials.
Yeah, we don't really know at this point, so there remains to be a lot more work to be done on these sites. And let me just add that the work to understand the civilization is further complicated by the fact that this was one of the most bombed places probably on the planet, dating back to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, between 1963 I mean, 1964 and 1973, more or less, the United States dropped an incredible amount of ordnance on this area, and there's about 30% of the ordnance didn't explode, failed to detonate, and so the ground here is littered with unexploded ordnance just below the surface.
Yeah,
so
I'm sorry.
It's sometimes called the most dangerous archaeological site in the world for that reason.
We actually have to be very careful to stay within the boundaries that are marked as clear, even today.
Yeah, this site has been cleared recently, but you cannot venture beyond these white markers that are found around here, because beyond the white markers it has not been cleared, and there's probably located unexploded ordnance.
Yeah, and actually around site number 1, which we explored a little earlier, you could see big bomb craters all over the place.
Yeah, a painful reminder of the tragedy that took place here in the 1960s and 1970s, and which continues to take place as this ordnance continues to be detonated to great physical harm.
Yeah, and of course they weren't just bombing the archaeological sites, they bombed a lot of the villages in this area, basically destroying most of the villages in this area as well as killing a lot of people.
Yeah,
so it's really a tragedy.
Very much so. Turning back to the jars for a moment before we conclude, the largest jars are up to a little over 3 meters in height. No, 3 meters in height, over 9 feet in height, and in diameter they can approach 3 meters as well. So these are enormous stone containers, megalithic, which means in Latin large stone. The material is usually sandstone. The geology of this area is sedimentary, and so sandstone is abundant. Some of the jars are made out of limestone, some were made out of conglomerate, and a small number of small jars were also made out of granite, a much harder material to work. But most of them are made out of sandstone. You know, you can compare this to other megalithic sites in the world, such as Stonehenge, for example, or Easter Island. But this is one of the most mysterious and powerful, impressive megalithic sites I've ever visited. Don't you agree, Roz?
Yeah, and this particular site is actually quite beautiful. There's lovely mountains surrounding us and nice hillside.
Yeah, I think Com is panning slowly around us, and you can see the mountains. As I said, most of the jar sites are actually not on the plateau proper, but on the periphery of the plateau, the slopes of the mountains that ring this area. And I would add too that, and we say this all the time in places like this, Roz, but we are literally the only tourists at this site.
Actually, right at the moment, we're the only people at the site.
I think we had to hike about a half a mile through rice paddies to get here. Yes. So the approach was interesting.
And some very angry-looking bulls, I might add.
Cows and water buffaloes. So the approach was quite interesting too. Well, we're going to continue to explore site number 3, and then before we conclude our visit to the Plain of Jars, we're also going to visit site number 2. Roz, it's been great traveling with you, exploring yet another archaeological site in the world, and more adventures to come.
Bye-bye.